Hello everyone. Today I'll be discussing the Sacramento County Deputy Sheriff's Association, also known as DSA. I'll cover who they represent, how Janus versus AFS CME decision affected them, a recent peer-reviewed article on public employee unions, and finally a news story about how Wisconsin's Act 10 and how it all connects to this week's material. The Sacramento County Deputy Sheriff's Association is a public employee union representing sheriff's deputies and other law enforcement personnel within Sacramento County. Their members work across patrol, corrections, investigations, and specialized units. Because they operate within county government, they are considered public sector employees. The DSA is particularly interesting because of its political influence. They play a major role in public safety funding debates, collective bargaining negotiations, and political endorsements for sheriff and county supervisor races. Their visibility makes them a strong example of how public sector unions shape local policy. In 2018, the Supreme Court ruled in Janus versus AFS-CME that public employees cannot be required to pay agency fees unless they affirmatively opt in. This shifted unions from an opt-out to an opt-in model, which had major financial implications for public sector unions nationwide. Like all public sector unions, the DSA could no longer collect mandatory fees from non-members. However, law enforcement unions were among the least affected by Janus. Membership stayed strong because deputies rely heavily on union protections, legal defense, and bargaining power. The DSA increased member engagement and communication, but overall, their political and organizational strength remained. I chose a peer-reviewed article by Battaglio and French titled Public Sector Unions in Post-Janus Era. The authors explain that unions had to adapt to the financial and organizational challenges created by Janus. Many unions strengthened internal organizing and communication strategies. Interestingly, though, law enforcement unions were among the least affected because of the strong occupational identity and the perceived need for union protection. And this aligns closely with what we see in the DSA. My main takeaways from the article was that Janus didn't destroy public sector unions. Instead, it forced them to adapt. Law enforcement unions, including the DSA, remained resilient because their members rely heavily on union support. The ruling reshaped union strategy more than union existence. I also reviewed a PBS news story about Wisconsin's Act 10, passed in 2011. Act 10 dramatically restricted collective bargaining rights for public employees, especially teachers and state workers. One thing I learned that I didn't know before is that Act 10 continues to shape Wisconsin politics more than a decade later, and that the legal challenges are still ongoing. Act 10 relates directly to this week's material because it illustrates how state-level policy interventions can substantially weaken public sector unions, particularly those whose members did not perceive the union as providing significant value. The legislation exposed a key vulnerability in unions with lower levels of member engagement or institutional legitimacy. This dynamic also provides important context for understanding the implications of Janus versus AFS-CME. Both Act 10 and Janus reflect broader national efforts to constrain public sector union influence. And together, they demonstrate that unions with weaker internal cohesion or perceived utility were disproportionately affected by these legal and political shifts. In conclusion, the DSA is a strong example of a public sector union with significant political influence. While Janus changed the financial landscape for unions, law enforcement unions like DSA remained resilient. And research shows that unions adapted through stronger organizing, and Wisconsin's Act 10 illustrates the long-term consequences for restricting union rights. Thank you for listening.